Hi, my name's Dave Flynn, and thanks for watching my bass collection. Today we're taking a look at the Roland GR77 Bass Synth, the controller and the module, and we're having a look at the ins and outs of that. And there's a lot to kind of like to have a look at in terms of both. Really, just to give you a bit of a flavour, I suppose, of the unit, and I'll give you a bit of perspective of how I use the unit in real-time play. For some of you, I'm assuming that you're sort of having a look at this because you have a bit of an interest in the in bass synths, or you might even be having a look at a GR700 guitar or a GR77 bass synth at the moment to purchase. So hopefully this will give you a little bit of an idea. Certainly, if you have a look on the side here, there is not a lot out there, and there are some sort of synth samples that you can have a look at. But just to be aware that some of those synth samples that you'll see from people using them tend to be using the controller, this G77 controller, with other synth modules. So not necessarily the GR77 or the GR700. So just be aware of that. Certainly, if you have a look on the internet, though, there are some other sound samples out there, so have a look at that, and there's a bit of information, technical information about the units as well if you really want to get into that side of it. I don't want to get too much into the technical part of it. I really just want to sort of get into sort of looking at the bass itself and the floor unit, giving you a bit of an idea of how that all went together. As you know, I like to do a bit of a background on all of these sorts of things, but I'm not going to get too into the guitar side of it. And as we sort of have a look at it, you'll find that while Roland had a bit of a specific idea about how guitarists would tend to use the GR700, which is the guitar version of this unit, and which was actually the first thing that came out before the bass, they weren't as 100% sure how you as a bass player would actually use the unit, and they really only had a really rough idea of how that would kind of work. And I guess if you have a look at some of the advertising and some of the spiel that went on from that, they were kind of hoping that we as bass players would tend to work that out ourselves. So I'll have a look at that a little bit further as well. So stay tuned, stay with me, and we'll just talk about the background of the GR700 in a sec. So it all starts with Roland's GR500 guitar synth, which was released in 1978-79, somewhere around that period. And it's seen as just a huge breakthrough for guitarists, because it unlocks a sonic palette to them via MIDI that they haven't had in the past, and the sounds that could be produced by the guitar synth were just amazing. And for experimental music, it was just an amazing concept, and loved by a lot of players. It was pretty much a Les Paul looking guitar attached by a SCSI cable to very much a traditional synth module with all the dials and the faders that you'd expect to see on an old analog synth, and it was all on a stand. So it was kind of an interesting looking unit. Have a look at some images on Google, and you'll see what the GR500 looked like. And even from some old magazine advertisements at the time, you'll see what it sort of looked like, and you'll see that it was kind of an interesting looking thing. And on the guitar itself, it had a little control unit that sort of stuck out from it, that the guitarists could make changes themselves as well. And it was the glimpse of what was sort of to come later on. It was a monophonic unit as well, but it was really, as I said, a glimpse of what would become later on. The big deal came a couple of years later with the introduction of the second generation guitar synth by Roland, which was the GR300. Now it's interesting that they go back in numbers, but the GR300 is the one that people still talk about today as being the the best guitar synth of the time, even till now. And it really was, and the big deal came because really Roland had taken their GR500 and squashed it down into a floor module. It also was the first guitar synth to allow the guitarist or the player a variety of controllers, so you weren't stuck with just one controller. You actually had a choice of controller to go with the unit, and there were a few different ones that were available. There was a Strat, there was a Telly looking one, there was something else there as well, and it was the first time that that a controller came out for bass as well, and so there was a dedicated unit for the bass player. The other side part to that was that, and I'll talk about it later on as well, is that these controllers were made for Roland by Ibanez. And it's about that time when Ibanez changed from being a guitar manufacturer of copied American instruments and became a manufacturer of their own instruments. And you'll see that from the GR series synths, that the designs for those controllers would eventually become Ibanez's Artist and Roadstar series later on down the track. And that's where the change really came for Ibanez in that perspective as well. The other big significant thing about the GR300, which everyone talks about, is the string tracking system developed for the GR300. Now you've got to consider that, unlike a keyboard synth, a guitar synth has to have a lot more considerations in terms of tracking. For instance, with a keyboard synth, you basically just got a key that you turn on and off. That's pretty much like a switch. You press down on the key, sends electrical current through some sort of processor, gets processed, comes out the other end as a synth sound of some description. So it's pretty much on and off. You press down on it, makes the sound, take your finger off, comes off. That's it. With a string-based synth though, you've got a lot more considerations, because strings can be plucked, they can be picked, they can be tap strummed, you've got harmonics, you've got subharmonics, you can bend, you've got overtones, just a whole variety of variables that are there. All of that has to be processed through a processor and come out as one MIDI sound at the end. And that's a lot of processing power that needs to go into that to do that. And it was at that time that where the GR300 came into its own, because for guitarists found that unlike other guitar synths that were probably out there, they didn't have to change their style or adapt their playing to suit that of the synth. They could use their own style of playing and do their own thing, and it worked really well. And that was one of the beauties of the GR300. And it was loved by a lot of players. Andy Summers, Robert Fripp, John McLaughlin. There were a whole lot of people out there who were using the GR300. And if you have a look on the internet, you'll see that those sorts of players that were there. And I'll give you a few samples and a few ideas of where to have a look at that. On the Police, you'll see Andy Summers using that in things like Don't Stand So Close to Me, and a whole lot of those things. It's all over that. And it was really loved by those kind of guys. But things changed a little bit later on. So what changed? Well, just like new technology today, no sooner someone brings out a piece of technology, there's another manufacturer that brings out something bigger and better. That was no different with synthesizers at the time, particularly between people like Roland, Yamaha, Korg, and those guys. One manufacturer would bring out one, someone would bring out something bigger and better. For Roland, it was their flagship at the time, their Jupiter series analog synthesizers, the JX3P and the JX8P. And I guess they were keen to build upon those, and that was around sort of 1983 or so. And if you're kind of, don't quote me on that, but if you're kind of a bit more knowledgeable in that area, you might kind of drop a note as to actually when that occurred. But it was around that kind of time. And I suppose Roland, wanting to build upon that technology, set about developing a new generation of string-based synth based upon that technology. Now, rather than going back and developing upon the already successful GR300 synth, guitar synth, which was loved by a lot of players, they basically looked at building a new system from the ground up. Now, that seems great in theory, but in reality, it presented a whole lot of new problems. And the biggest problem to all of that was the tracking system, which was so great in the GR300, was ditched for something completely new in the GR700 and the GR77. Now, it takes advantage of a few things, the new technology. So it was put into one kind of floor unit, which builds upon, at the time, Roland's already successful Boss stomp box units, and you can kind of see here the pedals that's sort of very similar to that kind of technology that was going on at the time. It also built upon the for the guitar, the JX3P synth module, and for the bass, it came a little bit later on, the JX8P synth modules. The string tracking system that went along with it, though, was seen as nowhere near as good as the GR300. And for players that are already sort of familiar with the GR300 and have used the GR300 quite successfully, lamented over the fact that the GR700 just didn't come up to the same the same standard as the predecessor. Which was very sad at the time, and particularly as the unit had a whole lot of other problems. It could probably excuse all of those if the tracking system had been so good, and those those little things just sort of plagued the GR700. Things like the glitchy MIDI system that came along at the time. Even though MIDI was still in its infancy, it's still seen as very glitchy. The one thing, though, that I suppose stands out from the GR700 was this redeveloped controller specifically made for the unit at the time, and the guitar particularly, and the bass unit. The bass are seen even today as pretty much iconic symbols of the 80s, particularly in sort of the music world. And even now, people still see it as a very space-aged and very sort of out there design. And people who are not aware of the synth or where its sort of background comes from still see it as a very sort of modern design and technology, which is kind of interesting, and just shows the test of time for Roland in that perspective. It's just a shame that there were a whole lot of other little glitchy things that went along with it, and that's where we'll have a look at those in my next couple of episodes. We'll particularly have a look at the controller, and we'll have a look at the floor unit itself. The other thing that we'll have a look at too is how I use it in live play, because one of the interesting things that as we come across it was that while the guitar itself, the guitar synth, was already sort of being used by guitarists and was being seen as kind of like as like opening up a sonic palette for guitarists, and could be seen sort of as being well used, and the ideas were already there. Roland themselves weren't really sure how you, as a bass player, would actually end up using this unit, and that's very much seen in a lot of the sort of the press releases that sort of came out, and sort of the spiel that came out at the time when this unit was released. And you'll see, but Roland really didn't have an idea. They only had two thoughts as to how you maybe use it as a bass player, and really one of those was quite bizarre anyway. And they were kind of hoping that we as bass players would come up with our own ideas of how that would work. So that's probably why it didn't catch on as much as, say, the guitar version. But we'll have a look at that in more detail. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a glimpse of where we're going with this. And stick around and we'll have a look at the controller next. Cheers.